I had a chance to read a story to you, and it's one of my very, very favourite books. I absolutely adore it, and it's called The Witches by Roald Dahl. I'm sure lots of you have heard of Roald Dahl before. I think he's fantastic. So I'm going to start reading. I particularly love this book because he uses his imagination so well that when I've read this to some of my children before, they've been so frightened because they really do think that witches are real, because Roald Dahl describes it so very well. So let me read it to you. Roald Dahl, The Witches. First of all, a note about witches. In fairy tales, witches always wear silly black hats and black cloaks, and they ride on broomsticks. But this is not a fairy tale. This is about real witches. The most important thing you should know about real witches is this. Listen very carefully. Never forget what is coming next. Real witches dress in ordinary clothes and look very much like ordinary women. They live in ordinary houses and they work in ordinary jobs. That is why they are so hard to catch. A real witch hates children with a red-hot, sizzling hatred that is more sizzling and red-hot than any hatred you could possibly imagine. Now, this is a story of a boy who goes to live with his grandmother, and she tells him all about witches and where they come from. So this is a picture of the boy having a little cuddle with his grandmother, and she is an amazing storyteller. So let me read this bit. My grandmother. I, myself, had 2 separate encounters with witches before I was 8 years old. From the first I escaped unharmed, but on the second occasion I was not so lucky. Things happened to me that will probably make you scream when you read about them. That can't be helped. The truth must be told. The fact that I am still here and able to speak to you, however peculiar I may look, is due entirely to my wonderful grandmother. I bet you love your grandmothers too, don't you? My grandmother was Norwegian. The Norwegians know all about witches, for Norway, with its black forests and icy mountains, is where the first witches came from. My father and my mother were also Norwegian, but because my father had a business in England, I had been born there and had lived there and had started going to an English school. Twice a year at Christmas and in the summer, we went back to Norway to visit my grandmother. This old lady, as far as I could gather, was just about the only surviving relative we had on either side of our family. She was my mother's mother, and I absolutely adored her. When she and I were together, we spoke in either Norwegian or in English. It didn't matter which. We were equally fluent in both languages, and I have to admit that I felt closer to her than to my own mother. Soon after my 7th birthday, my parents took me, as usual, to spend Christmas with my grandmother in Norway. And it was over there, while my father and mother and I were driving in icy weather just north of Oslo, that our car skidded off the road and went tumbling down into a rocky ravine. My parents were killed. I was firmly strapped into the back seat and received only a cut on the forehead. I won't go into the horrors of that terrible afternoon. I still get the shivers when I think about it. I finished up, of course, back in my grandmother's house with her arms around me tight, and both of us crying the whole night long. And there they are again. That was probably the night it happened. Now he ended up living with his grandmother, and she told him all about her encounter of witches, and she wanted to warn him how dangerous it could be. The very next day, in order that we might both try to forget our great sadness, my grandmother started telling me stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and I was enthralled by everything she told me. But I didn't become really excited until she got onto the subject of witches. She was apparently a great expert on these creatures, and she made it very clear to me that her witch stories, unlike most of the others, were not imaginary tales. They were all true. They were the gospel truth. They were history. Everything she was telling me about witches had actually happened, and I had better believe it. And what was worse, what was far, far worse, was that witches were still with us. They were all around us, and I had better believe that too. Are you really being truthful, Grandmama? Really and truly truthful? I darling, she said, you won't last long in this world if you don't know how to spot a witch when you see one. But you told me that witches look like ordinary women, Grandmama, so how can I spot them? You must listen to me, my grandmother said. You must remember everything I tell you. After that, all you can do is cross your heart and pray to heaven and hope for the best. We were in the big living room of her house in Oslo, and I was getting ready for bed. The curtains were never drawn in that house, and through the window I could see huge snowflakes falling slowly onto an outside world that was as black as tar. So I'm going to tell you the first story that Grandmother said about a witch and what had happened a long, long time ago. My grandmother was the only grandmother I ever met who smoked cigars. She lit one now, a long black cigar that smelled of burnt rubber. The first child I knew who disappeared, she said, was called Ragnhild Hansen. Ragnhild was about 8 at the time, and she was playing with her little sister on the lawn. Their mother, who was baking bread in the kitchen, came outside for a breath of air. Where's Ragnhild, she said. She went away with a tall lady, the little sister said. What tall lady? The mother said. The tall lady in white gloves, my little sister said. She took Ragnhild by the hand and she led her away. No one, my grandmother said, ever saw Ragnhild again. Didn't they search for her, I asked. They searched for miles around. Everyone in the town helped, but they never found her. What happened to the other 4 children, I asked. They vanished just as Ragnhild did. How, Grandmama? How did they vanish? In every case, a strange lady was seen outside the house just before it happened. And then Grandmother goes on to tell the boy about how to spot a witch, which I think is a very important skill to have. How to recognise a witch. Now, if you love this story, you can carry on reading it yourself. The next evening, after my grandmother had given me a bath and took me once again into the living room for another story. Tonight, the old woman said, I'm going to tell you how to recognise a witch when you see one. Can you always be sure? I asked. No, she said, you can't. And that's the trouble, but you can make a pretty good guess. She was dropping cigar ash all over her lap, and I hoped she wasn't going to catch on fire before she told me how to recognise a witch. In the first place, she said, a real witch is certainly always to be wearing gloves when you meet her. Surely not always, I said. What about in the summer when it's hot? Even in the summer, my grandmother said. She has to. Do you want to know why? Why? I asked. Because she doesn't have any fingernails. Instead of fingernails, she has thin, curvy claws like a cat, and she wears the gloves to hide them. Mind you, lots of very respectable women wear gloves, especially in winter, so this doesn't help you very much. Mama used to wear gloves, I said. Not in the house. My grandmother said, witches wear gloves even in the house. They only take them off when they go to bed. How do you know all this, Grandmama? Don't interrupt, she said. Just take it all in. The second thing to remember is that a real witch is always bald. Bald, I said. Bald as a boiled egg, my grandmother said. I was shocked. There was something indecent about a bald woman. Why are they bald, Grandmama? Don't ask me why, she snapped, but you can take it from me that not a single hair grows on a witch's head. Ooh, how horrid. Disgusting, my grandmother said. If she's bald, she'll be easy to spot, I said. Not at all. My grandmother said a real witch always wears a wig to hide her baldness. She wears a first-class wig, and it's almost impossible to tell a really first-class wig from ordinary hair unless you give it a pull to see if it comes off. Then that's what I'll have to do, I said. Don't be foolish, my grandmother said. You can't go around pulling at the hair of every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. Just you try it and see what happens. So that doesn't help much either, I said. None of these things is any good on its own, my grandmother said. It's only when you put them all together that they begin to make a little sense. Mind you, my grandmother said, she went on, these wigs do cause a rather serious problem for witches. What problem, Grandmama? They make the scalp itch most terribly, she said. You see them when an actress wears a wig, or if you or I were to wear a wig, we'd be putting it on over our own hair, but a witch has to put it straight onto her naked scalp. and the underneath of a wig is always very rough and scratchy. It sets up a frightful itch on the bald skin. It causes nasty sores on the head. Wig rash, the witches call it. It doesn't half itch. What other things might I look for to recognise a witch? I asked. Look for the nose holes, my grandmother said. Witches have slightly larger nose holes than ordinary people. The rim of each nose hole is pink and curvy, like the rim of a certain kind of seashell. Why do they have such big nose holes? I asked. For smelling with, my grandmother said. A real witch has the most amazing powers of smell. She can actually smell out a child who is standing on the other side of the street on a pitch black night. She couldn't smell me, I said. I've just had a bath. Oh, yes, she could, my grandmother said. The cleaner you happen to be, the more smelly you are to a witch. That can't be true, I said. An absolutely clean child gives off the most ghastly stench to a witch, my grandmother said. The dirtier you are, the less you smell. But that doesn't make sense, Grandmama. Oh, yes, it does, my grandmother said. It isn't the dirt that the witch is smelling, it is you. The smell that drives a witch mad actually comes right out of your own skin. It comes oozing out of your skin in waves, and these waves, stink waves the witches call them, go floating around the air, and they hit the witch right smack in her nostrils. They send her reeling. Now wait a minute, Grandmama, don't interrupt, she said. The point is this. When you haven't washed for a week and your skin is all covered over with dirt, then quite obviously the stink waves cannot come oozing out nearly so strongly. I shall never have a bath again, I said. You don't have one too often, my grandmother said. Once a month is quite enough for a sensible child. And then she goes on to talk a little bit further about witches. But I'm not going to read any more. I'm going to let you read the other things. See if you can work out what you need to remember to look for in a real witch. I hope you enjoy. Good night.